All right, welcome back, friends and comrades. I'm here with Derick Varn, who is a godfather of left stream Marxist streaming. Derick actually got me started with this channel, if you can believe it or not. He sort of trained me in how to actually download the right program, do some of the technical things. And I'm not the only one that Varn has initiated into the podcasting world in some ways. Obviously, I started my podcast before I knew Derick, but I definitely have leaned on him pretty closely, both publicly and privately, for guidance as I try to create these conversations. Today, we wanted to look at the question about revolution, and more specifically, want to kind of make an inventory. This is an ambitious endeavor that we have here, no question, and this may actually have to become a two-part conversation, which I would love if Derick would come back to talk to me. But by way of introduction, Derick has been thinking about Marxist work. He's a sort of, I guess you're somewhat of an autodidact. I mean, some people like that term, some people don't like that term. I think it's fine, and I think it. I mean, you know, you can talk about your educational background as well, but I know most of your Marxist work is actually through practical organizing, through podcasting, and through your own reading, which is extensive. So the objective for today is to start off. It's sort of a two-part conversation. We want to start off with a bit of an assessment about the primary conditional impediments to the possibility of revolution in our time, and I've flagged a few. I've flagged a few of those. I'll get to that after I let Derick say hello and everything like that. And then the second part of our conversation will be about how theorists, like Marxist thinkers, have abandoned revolution, have maintained a fidelity to revolution, albeit perhaps problematically so, and the variations of the meaning of revolution today from different Marxist as well as post-Marxist, even though, of course, post-Marxist is a pejorative, sort of like hipster. Nobody wants to be called a post-Marxist.
Not anymore. I mean, it's interesting. I actually think in the 90s and aughts, people actively courted the phrase post-Marxist, and now it's a slur.
They did. Like Lukacs, for example, after hegemony and socialist strategy, I think they were fine with being called a post-Marxist. And I feel like, in a way, that text itself is a very interesting, sort of written in the late 80s, the dawn of post-Marxism in some ways.
I mean, what I consider post-Marxism really beginning with the response in the late 70s, early 80s of a lot of the French new left. And that splits in two ways. A lot of them just become reactionaries. We don't talk about them in America. They're not actually as important to American philosophy. They're kind of more or less part of like we might call it French analytic tradition that doesn't get translated here as much. And then you have the post-structuralist, or sometimes I even think of them as post-structuralist, but like the Baudrillards, the Lukacs, and I think Baudrillard is instructive here with them because Baudrillard is the most. We actually have documents of his falling out with Marxism that are pretty clear and also make it clear how it relates to things like 1968. Because if you trace it through Baudrillard, you can see this reaction of ideas that emerged in 1968, both in the Maoist and in the situationist parts of that.
Right.
Mixing in with Althusser, mixing in with semiotics, and then you have a kind of what I consider actually a somewhat superficial critique, and I'm actually a defender of Baudrillard in a lot of ways, but a somewhat superficial critique about the aims of what Marx got wrong in the movement of the proletariat. But if you actually get his books about his response to the Communist Party and the Mitterrand government, you realize that like theory wasn't the only thing driving this. It was actually failures of the French Communist Party that was really driving his theoretical cul-de-sacs, which is why I think there's a lot of talk right now on the left about the problems of post-Marxism that blame post-Marxism on the problems of the intellectual left, and I think that's fine to do like ideologically, but it ignores why these kind of strange ideological hybrids emerged in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually do not think it's because of like active betrayal of a few professors who have some kind of secret petty bourgeois consciousness. I think it's much larger than that.
Added to which those debates risk falling into anti-intellectualism, which I see as rampant. In other words, a kind of an uninterest in theory as such, or somehow the idea that sort of theoretical struggle is sort of always prone to being co-opted by an academic apparatus or agenda, or as you say, petit bourgeois. And your point on the election of Francois Mitterrand, the socialist, and the way that Mitterrand actually destroyed the possibility of electoral movement for the left within France. I mean, the French scene has always, after the Second World War, been very much out ahead in their defeats. Like they experienced defeats sort of sooner than other Western parliamentary systems or democratic systems. And they've been in that way instructive. And I don't mean theoretically, I mean purely practically, like the contradictions in France. And that's actually why I felt like one of the best lines of understanding 68 was in a way as a kind of post-colonial Marshall Plan, revolt against the Marshall Plan. Precisely. This is Michel Closcard's primary argument, right? Which is basically why psychoanalysis and Marxism was so important for the young students in 68, it was basically a kind of Western post-capitalist semi-colonial paternalism that they were pushing against, which had obviously the background context of the Vietnam War and intensified imperialism, Stalinism, the Cold War, etc. So you could see the Oedipal revolt against bureaucratic Stalinism on the one hand, as well as American imperial cultural colonialism, right? Cultural colonialism. So it's a sort of added to which, of course, they're trying to imitate the Chinese Cultural Revolution and all of that strange lost in translation situation, right?
Right. I mean, one of the things that we have to look at in the French case is Trotskyism and Maoism are more important in France and Britain than they are, interestingly, in a lot of the rest of the world at this time. And that doesn't remain true, but like there's not French Guevarists, for example, and like there's not a Guevarist tendency, which in Latin America there clearly is. In the developing world, there's kind of a split between people who favor Khrushchevian, like humanist Marxist-Leninism versus people who favor various forms of anti-revisionism. But Maoism is interesting, and it's a bunch of different things. I think like one of the things, this could be a whole episode, but like the varieties of Maoism. Maoism is one of the tendencies, even more than Trotskyism, where I don't know much about you just by you invoking that term. But French Maoism is interesting because whereas in a lot of the developing world, the Maoist tendencies are kind of a critique of the official communist parties that are aligned with the Comintern for deviating. In France, that's not the case. Maoism is a critique of the French Communist Party for being too developmentalist, too patient, too willing to go along with the Marshall Plan, too into the Popular Front. And it has a veneer of anti-revisionism. But I mean, this is the milieu that produces both Badiou and Althusser. So that's to say that it's like mechanistically faithful even to Chinese variants of communism, whichever you want to go. And one of the things about the 1960s is like the Chinese Communist Party is kind of theoretically throwing spaghetti at the wall. Like, you know, you have three worlds theory, which is picked up and abandoned. You have labor aristocracy theory, which is tied into three worlds theory, which is picked up and kind of abandoned. You have cultural revolutionism, which is related to that, but not exactly the same. You have the insistence on the need for kind of quasi-permanent incorporation of the peasantry into the apparatus in a way that is unique. There's a lot of people who oversimplify this and say, well, in, you know, classical Marxism and in Marxist Leninism, the peasantry is not important. And I'm like, well, dekulakization complicates that, but one of the primary innovations of Lenin that we don't talk about very much is that he explicitly stated that the revolutionary dictatorship in Russia would have to be a revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat first, but also the peasant. That's one of the differences. That and revolutionary defeatism is really the only differences between, quote, Leninism and the Second International.
Yeah.
But, you know, this introduces a whole set of problems. Like, we're kind of working from the center going back, but this introduces a whole set of problems to what the conception of revolution is. And in China, and I think China is really instructive here, China and France end up being kind of flashpoints. You have a lot of concurrent developments to what happens in Europe. So, for example, the idea of proletarian nationhood develops amongst the national syndicalist and amongst the pre-Mao faction of the Chinese Communist Party in response to the official line taken by the Comintern. And so this idea of, for example, national proletarian subjectivity becomes a thing. Now, in the West, in Western Europe, it is the basis for fascism in Italy. We have to be specific here. Again, we could have a whole show on this, but fascism and like, say, Hitlerism or Nazism in general are, you know, but Italian fascism is kind of more than the other kinds of fascism interesting because it is more tied into deviations from the left itself. That's not true in Spain, and it's not true in Germany as much.
Yeah, I think this is helpful. I feel like on your point regarding Lenin and peasantry, yeah, Kautsky was sort of convinced over time. You know, it's really interesting to see his wavering. At times he supports the Menshevik position, at other times he supports Lenin. He always tended to see Lenin as a bit of a loose cannon, as too puritanical, and that, you know, Leninism bred a certain militancy which concerned him. But ultimately, the conditions of the peasantry in places like Russia and China would be so qualitatively different than they were in Italy and Germany, in France, that to speak of that crossover, that class composition crossover question, is very strange. And added to which, from the first 1906 Russian Revolution to 1917, that intervening period is a very important one, right, in Russia, right, whereby the question that Kautsky learns from observing the Bolsheviks is basically that the bourgeoisie in Russia was highly underdeveloped, right? So the proletariat had autonomous culture building capacities in Russia that were very unique to Russia, right?
Right.
And then in China, the working class organization, I'd like to see what you think about this, as far as I've read, you know, as Maoists try to organize the industrial working class in Chinese cities, they did not succeed near as much as they did with organizing peasantry. And it was the link between the students and the peasantry which proved fundamental, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Well,
and
I
that,
think
go ahead.
I think we do have to deal with imperialism here, and in that if Tsarist transitions to semi-bourgeois states, which it never achieves, but after the 1906 revolution, it starts leaning that way, and you have pockets of capitalist development in Russia. If it is imperial, it is self-imperial, as in this is being done by a cadre of aristocrats to be able to link up to the imperial capitalist West. Whereas in China, it is imposed. And it is imposed after a series of things that I think we unfairly do not consider revolutions, the Taiping Rebellion and the Boxer Rebellion, which I just like to point out, even on the scale of death, 6 times more people died in the Taiping than in the U.S. Civil War, and the U.S. Civil War is per capita the bloodiest war in U.S. history. So, yes, I don't know the per capita adjustments, but these are violent class or proto-class struggles of a level that Europe never even really saw in its bourgeois revolutions. And they don't totally have a bourgeois character, but they're so infused with parts of bourgeois ideology through, like, with the Boxers, through the influence of Christianity, which comes, that you can't say that they're completely removed from it either. And that, China has always been one of the questions for Marxists, which actually kind of leads to this breakdown of the like Soviet mechanistic model revolution that Marx is inconsistent about, and we can talk about that later. Because the question becomes, is Marx's concern about capital, properly speaking, necessarily Eurocentric, and that's where capitalism is, and that since Asiatic modes of development for him are, in some ways, Marx doesn't really deal with them, but in so much that he does, he sees them as like almost too stable. That like the class conflict in there is held in check by imperialism or strongman politics or whatever. And because of this, it is sort of the here be dragons for Marxism. And then when the second major, communist revolution happens in China, but happens under even like if the Russian Revolution is already a theoretical problem for the Second International's conception of revolution, the Chinese Revolution would have been, if the Second International still was relevant, an even bigger challenge to that. And this is why it's kind of important to understand when we ask ourselves, why did this kind of clear stages notion of revolution break down? China is crucial to that for everybody, even the ultra left, and it's definitely part of what's going on in France. It's why it's turned to. And as you say, France is an interesting litmus test because for most of the 20th century, we can use it to say, okay, this is where Western Marxism is likely to go if Western Marxism has any coherent definition. What are Marxists going to do in places outside of the Warsaw Pact and the sphere of the non-aligned movement aligned with China? You kind of have to look to France and Italy, which is not particularly surprising. I think if you look at the history of, say, Marxism, the fact that Britain is never really a vanguard in this anywhere is itself surprising, right? Like that even Marx thought, and Engels basically has to come up with a bunch of theories after Marx's death to deal with the fact, okay, is it imperialism? Is it a labor aristocracy? What is it that leads to Britain not being one of the hotbeds? Because while it has an incomplete bourgeois revolution, a truly formally incomplete bourgeois revolution, their aristocracy was reinstated, and while it is somewhat controlled by the bourgeoisie, it exists even now. The question becomes, why is this the case? Why can we not rely on Britain, France, or Italy? Why do we have to rely on Germany? And one of the background assumptions is not particularly clearly stated, but that Germany is the most likely because it's an advanced capitalist country, but it is not able to be imperial in the same way because it unifies too late. And that is also kind of seen as the case with Italy. So Italy unifies as a nation later, but because of that, it's shut out of imperialism to some degree. It's not that they don't have imperial holdings, they do, but it's relatively minor compared to the, quote, mature bourgeois states, France and England. And then Portugal and Spain, which have a different form of imperial colonialism that's kind of proto-capitalist, it's maintaining, but gives them, again, a different grounds and a different basis for suppressing their, or maybe not tasking their bourgeoisie with anything.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the problems of Western Europe. The problems of Russia become immediate too, because Plekhanov famously thought you had to fully develop the bourgeois revolution and thus instantiate a pretty liberal in the economic terms of that society first to do the development before you had the revolution. Plekhanov obviously has an effect on Lenin. Lenin theoretically believes that, but there's also this kind of incorporation of, maybe even accidentally, of like the Veresturic letters, where Lenin's strategy is still based on at least one of the core nations of Europe who are capitalist joining them, and he particularly thinks it's going to be Germany, in this global revolution, and that's going to enable them to kind of have less of a dependence on state capitalism. State capitalism is a concept for Lenin is not a critique of the Soviet Union. He sees it as like something we got to go through really quickly, and it's best if we join up with a socialist form in the West. We can get their technologies. We don't have to develop them internally. We're not going to be besieged in the same way. When the German Revolution fails, basically that cracks that. And I think Bukharin is, he's probably one of my favorite Bolsheviks, but his theory of Bolshevism in one country and our socialism in one country is based off the idea that, okay, we're going to have to do a form of monopoly capital and buy time until we can lead a revolution in these other countries. But this puts everybody in a kind of precarious position because as the first country to actually have a socialist revolution that is successful, and we can compare this to, say, Mexico, where there's as big of a revolution happens at the same time, but that since there are bourgeois elements in that revolution and socialist elements and peasant socialist or anarchist elements in that revolution is harder to understand the nature of, and the Russians don't seem to really consider being able to join up with that. And by the 1920s, they're absolutely certain that they can't, and they're right, because the center liberal developmentalists win that. So it leaves Russia kind of in a weird place. They're preeminent amongst the international. They set the terms. You have the what is it? The 21 points, 20 points that come out with the ABC of Communism, which is the initial program.
Never read these days.
Yeah, and it's a good program, by the way. I mean, the conditions, however, instantly split the international, even in places where the socialists theoretically were closer to the Bolshevik position. So I know this is something Americans are often surprised by, but the American Socialist Party was one of the few socialist parties that voted with the Bolsheviks about the war and was basically in line with the Zimmerwald left. They had their own jingoistic and racist sub-elements within it. I mean, there's all kinds of problems in the Socialist Party, but they are more or less aligned with what the Bolsheviks want. The conditions of joining the Comintern, however, and it's particularly its conditions on purging certain elements constantly, means that like even someone like Eugene Debs, who is I mean, he has some critiques of Lenin in particular. Like he for example, I think wrongly thinks completely killing the royal family is unnecessary once you've killed the Tsar. I get his moral qualms there, but he doesn't ever completely break with the Bolsheviks either. A lot of people aligned with him actually do, as individuals, join the eventually formed Communist Party. But if Debs can't join, I mean, you can see the problem that's emerging from this. So on one hand, you have to protect this revolution, which is truly besieged in Russia. On the other hand, that in and of itself makes the possibility of revolution in the West harder because it divides the socialists. And until the Popular Front is established in 1936, specifically because of the Spanish Civil War, any attempt at detente between the socialists and communists are scuttled by the communists. So, for example, the reconstituted Second International actually does invite like the Comintern to sit, and they turn it down. In some ways, I understand the communist position because we do have to remember, and this is not Kautsky, this is Ebert, but like the right of the SPD was increasingly moving towards German historicism away from Marxism. This is particularly instantiated in like an academic figure like Werner Sombart. And that a lot of these people defect again in the 20s to the Nazis. And so the quote social fascism thing, which I think is an overstatement and disastrous because it enables fascism to actually come to power in Germany, is still, it's less of an insane position than people think, because there were so many people from the right of the SPD, particularly the Ebert faction, who became national socialist. It throws even people like Karl Reddick into a loop, and Karl Reddick's generally considered, the left end of the Bolsheviks. But like he ends up praising people in the 20s who end up being diehard anti-communists and socialist killers. Like, and the Russians during this entire time don't really know how to, or the Bolsheviks really don't really know how to deal with this, and they're dealing with their own problems, which is, I don't know, a fucking civil war. I mean, the violent part of the Russian Revolution, as far as after October, is really the Civil War. It is not the October Revolution, which is not bloodless, but it is relatively not violent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, it's a great point because I feel like civil war is a catalyzing moment, of course, that China and Russia both experience a distance from the core, like in world systems theory, they're kind of peripheral in some sense of the imperial hegemon. So that civil war experience created a certain class turbulence and fragmentation that allowed for a lot of combination of luck to happen, frankly, in many cases, especially in China, as Mao is fighting Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, for example. Um, Added to which the support against Japan's imperialism, there was a lot of Western opportunism that really didn't care too much in some ways about who won that Chinese Civil War. That kind of gave them a certain leg up and so on. So the fact that the defeat of the German communists in 1922 is such a major blow is interesting when we reflect on its lessons for our time, because behind that tragedy is the fact that you have several decades of radical social democracy organizing in Germany. And that is something which, again, kind of fast forwarding to a post 1970s milieu like ours, that we simply lack, right?
Right.
So when we invoke comparisons and we accuse opportunism, fascism, right-wing deviations in the SPD, etc., how do you understand those comparisons to a situation like we have today, which is so weakened in terms of this neoliberal crisis? Like, on the one hand, I would characterize the crisis after 2008 as a crisis of the legitimacy of the centrist governing coalitions in the West, right? That's obvious.
Mm.
Combined with the void or the absence of a left, of a strengthened left social democracy, right? So that the possibility of left social democracy has not even been permitted to enter into the room, right? So in that situation, at a pure like technocratic, bureaucratic level, how do comparisons to SPD, to Second International, bureaucratic socialism, and so on in France and Germany, and so on? I mean, can we even make those comparisons to today's time?
Not really. I mean, so one of the things that we have a problem, and this interestingly is picked up by friends of ours, in say the cosmonaut form of quote neo-Kautskyism, which I think we should rightly call that form of neo-Kautskyism, and I don't think they would even be mad at me for saying this. Early Leninism. What they're really interested in is Lenin's program of what is to be done, and maybe elements of his Last Testament in 1927. And they're interested in Bolshevik party discipline, but they actually reject. This is why they're neo-Kautskyist, is they reject the faction ban, and they reject, which really occurs in the Civil War, and they reject. They don't reject democratic centralism, but they do reject democratic centralism in terms of a slate in the party being centrally maintained by consensus, which is another like post 1919, 1921 Bolshevik innovation that is maintained by everybody else except for some Maoists, but that's spot by spot. But like Trotsky's, for example, maintain that. That's not a distinction for them. One of the things I think I think they, however, believe that is actually that overlaps with a group we're going to talk about in this post-Marxist response, the communization in its three primary forms: Duvet, theory communiste, and Endnotes, which is confusingly what is popularized in theory communiste in English. However, they have a separate position articulated later. It's not articulated in notes 1. It's really articulated in notes 5. And that was that the working class was really primarily a political creation. So instead of the unity of the class in itself and the class for itself, so the class in itself is the sociological construct of class, more or less, in its product and capital, and the class for itself is the class that is conscious of that. This is where the idea of class consciousness really comes from. It's not a word that Marx and Engels use a lot. It's really more used by Lukacs, but it is there. It is not. Some people will try to claim that, like, oh, it's totally foreign. It's a Lukacian innovation. That I don't think that's true. I found evidence for it in Marx too. That, like, there is this notion that the class in itself has to become the class for itself, and it does so through the merger of socialist, which is a class project, but is not seen to be inherently of or not of the working class, which I think a lot of people misunderstand. But, like, with the quote advanced sections of the working class who have to eventually take the leadership role over from the socialists. That's what is stated in Marx. That is the core of the thought that leads to, quote, vanguardism. A lot of people blame that on Lenin. I think people have rightly finally gotten smarter about that and realized that, like, no, that goes back to the Second International. Vanguardism is not totally like, oh, we need to tell the workers what to do because we know better. It is we need to educate the workers so that they can eventually assume leadership. And this is assumed in Lenin too. But the idea that the creation of the political party happens external to this is something that you can see all the way going back to Gramsci. There's a kind of fragment in Gramsci, which is, I believe, often entitled "The Russian Revolution versus Das Kapital," which is basically like, look, the self-organization of the proletariat did not happen from immiseration. We see this in Lenin's victory, and thus and for Gramsci, Lenin is vindicating one element in Marx against another element in Marx. So Gramsci sees these both as inherent in Marx, but that Lenin proves, one of them is more correct than the other. So this is the kind of Gramscian take. I think that, however, misses a large part of the context. While it is true that the SPD as we know it, and particularly the Marxists finally joining it from their own organizations in the 1890s, came at a low point of worker agitation and political power. There is still 100 years of worker agitation, and one of the things that we have to look at that I think is kind of unique to Germany, that I don't even think Marxists always articulate this way, is that the creation of the class in itself, the sociological reality of a proletarian in Germany, is actually, unlike in England, unlike in France, concurrent with the creation of working class parties. Whereas, yes, there are socialists going, in England and France going all the way back, but the idea of a working class party, a party that arises out of the coalition and coalescing of unions, right, of workers' movements, that is something that is unique to Germany and kind of specific to the fact that it was becoming an advanced capitalist nation, but it already had access to these socialist ideas. And that's why Marx, not a German nationalism or anything like that, but that's why Marx sees it as possibly important. But
Mm.
Again, to put it in Marx's time, Marx really thought the most likely breakout of this was probably going to be England.
Right.
So
Although when he wrote the Paris manuscripts, and it was from empirical direct experience with a more sophisticated class struggle that he encountered on the streets of Paris than in Germany. So, but that was only because Paris and France had already undergone more of the bourgeois revolution than had Germany. And this is something that Lukacs is huge on in terms of understanding how fascism in Germany was so vociferous. Well, it had to do with this socioeconomic deprivation that was unique to Germany in some sense. And of course,
Germany and Italy, I mean, it is actually kind of crucial that the two most active socialist parties emerge from countries that are, as we said early on, late to the bourgeois revolution and late to national unification.
mm-hmm.
This is, I think, unfortunately, going to be one of the things that occurs in the 50s and 60s to start changing Marxist notions of revolution, because we move from national liberation as being seen as something necessary for a modernizing project so that you have coherent people who can speak the same language and join the international. And then and then Lenin really hopes that by doing that, they will have national autonomy, but they will be fully instantiated socialist, and thus eventually through the joining, through almost a dialectical inversion, their nationalism will become irrelevant by their participation through an active Comintern.
Yeah. You see this in Marx's comments on the Irish question, for example.
Yeah. Right. And so it's not rooted in Marx. In Marx and Engels, it is nascent.
Mm-hmm.
So you see this in Marx. You also see this in their writing on Poland and on Hungarian, Serbian liberation. Interestingly, Marx and Engels put a lot more on Poland than we would today. But they weren't always. I mean, the one thing I'll say, they didn't see any national self-revelation as good, and that's actually kind of the point of me bringing that up. They were actually very specific on when they thought it would be progressive and when they wouldn't,
mm-hmm.
and partly, where it's at in the historical.
Oh yeah, I mean the same can be said of Marx's intervention regarding the necessity to support the Union cause against the Southern Confederates in civil wars. Similar motivations going on, and I fully agree with you that and a great thinker to refer to here is Isabelle Garot, who happens to be French but also happens to be a French communist philosopher who's like deeply opposed to the legacy of Althusser. And she says what she tries to do in her new book Communism and Strategy is basically provide a rebuke to this teleological or mechanistic conception of the stages of revolution, that you can read Marx to the letter and not arrive at such a conclusion at all, right? And she's very convincing in this regard, right?
Kohei Saito is also like this, but he goes further, and he does what also happened in what of the American New Left, which is to reject the idea of historical materialism altogether, more or less. I'm not sure. I'm still trying to. I'm personally still reading Saito, and his first book, Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism. I'm actually finding a pretty good exegesis of some problems in Marx, but I kind of, we already know where the Anthropocene book goes, so it's like, well,
yeah.
And I can see him beginning to lay on a lot of this misunderstanding is Engels' fault.
There's that. There's also some slightly more vague critiques of Eurocentrism, which I don't understand or find that convincing, to be honest. Perhaps that's a hangover from some of the ways that I've observed post-colonial academic analysis and the way it in a weird sense, latches onto Marxism and kind of renders both projects a bit incoherent at times. So I'm not as convinced of this like specificity of the problem of Eurocentrism. It almost seems in Saito to be an underthought fetish. But I also need to read more Saito, and I definitely see him as central thinker to work with and so on. But if we could go back to the ultra left tendency, just for benefit of listeners, let's lay it out a little bit more. I mean, I think for a lot of nuts and bolts socialists, it's something they don't even want to listen to. I mean, degrowth communism is now becoming that for a lot of social democrats, you know, American context, etc. It's becoming highly polemicized. And I think, Derick, you and I are people that are somewhat unique in the sense that we try to unite Marxists, and we can listen to the ultra left, we can listen to the neo-Kautskis and everything in between.
Yeah.
So my question is this: is sort of okay. Gilles Dauvé, Theory Communiste, Endnotes, we can say in general, puts forward, Bordiga as well, a very robust critique of bureaucracy and of this notion of the distinction between in itself and for itself. What they basically end up rejecting is programmatism in all forms, which results in my view, an argument that the subject of revolution is actually the contradiction of the experience of the proletariat in its immediacy, in some sense. And that any mediation from party apparatus, from program apparatus, must be avoided, right? Really at all costs, right?
Right. And, well, I find it interesting that you list Bordiga in there. Although
I only say that because in the essay by Dauvé, he's which is entitled, it's a very good, if you want to get a good grasp of it, the story of our origins.
Mm-hmm.
He references Bordiga as a, you know, part of the ultra left tendency, and I know that Bordiga is a unique figure, but
he's also referenced by Lenin. Like Bordiga's critiqued by Lenin and Leptin communism and infantile disorder. He is interesting because he's the only one who does not reject party mediation of the people that we're talking about. So if we want to talk about the people who reject party intermediation, are really any intermediation, you get to Pannekoek. And Pannekoek's an interesting figure because Pannekoek is cited positively against Kautsky by Lenin on specific things, which is not something that Pannekoek does back to Lenin. I mean, basically, Pannekoek sees Lenin as a bourgeois politician, more or less. But one of the things that people like, because if you deal with council communists today, some of them, even as early as in France in particular, as early as the 50s, they start coming up with this idea of like, well, maybe we don't need the total hostility to the party, so we can combine Pannekoek and Bordiga together. And that eventually leads to communization theory. If you talk to Bordigists and council communists, they both reject communization theory. But I think it's important to point out where it comes from, because it is this critique of bureaucracy, and it's this critique of any form of mediation other than the self-organization of the workers themselves. They basically also reject the merger formula for the communism is the experience of worker self-organization in terms of their own government, and that will manifest in terms of not syndicates. And they have a critique of syndicalism because they say it's too firm-based. It doesn't deal with the competition between firms. So if you're in syndicates, you're still competing against other firms, so you're still dividing up the working class. So co-ops aren't good enough for them. But they also reject unions as inherently bourgeois, and they reject the party as inherently bureaucratic and thus quasi-bourgeois. In some ways, they go further than anarchists. in Duvet, you have this, you know, Duvet is a product of this 50s, 60s tendency in the French ultra left, which we also see in elements of situationism, but it's not consistent in situationism, to try to combine the Burdagist critique of like democracy with the critique of bureaucracy and mediation that you find in Council Communist, which means that not only does the working class have to rule itself, but it has to rule itself directly, not even with representation from itself. And, you know, if there's a party, it has to emerge organically and it cannot be democratic. I don't really know what that means.
Right. And you see endnotes basically takes the same presupposition, but then it's not even really this experiential, empirical, sociological category of the working class, because endnotes then will provide all of this kind of post-1970s, whatever, financial capitalism era analysis of surplus populations, and then but they still retain that same presupposition there.
Right. I mean, what they do is theory communiste, and this is what makes them different from Duvet. Theory communiste and endnotes basically reject the idea of the necessity of the class as such. This is partly based on logic that is articulated in Duvet. Duvet, you know, chastises the working class for saying, like, the moment you become a class in yourself, you don't want to, well, he doesn't use this language, but this is his point. The moment you become a class for yourself, you don't want to abolish yourself as a class in yourself. Like that class abolition is no longer your goal, it's class maintenance. They take this further and they say, well, that's true. It's true in every situation. And the reason why the national liberation movements are successful is because they do abolish the peasantry. It is the self-abolition of the peasantry, but they don't do it on their terms. It's not a peasants' revolution. Therefore, what we should do is abandon this notion of the necessity of the working class at all, and see the subject of revolution as, in some ways, similar Moshe Postone, but in a completely different, or even developmentalist, but it's inverted. Instead of the self-organization of the working class being prompted by crisis, theory communiste and to some degree endnotes, although endnotes is more complicated, they seem to take the position that revolution is the crisis, and that the crisis will generate communism, and what we need to do is lay the grounds for communism, and we're just not going to fucking worry about the working class at all. Right. It is not relevant to our question. And I think it's interesting because this kind of ultra-leftism combines a bunch of different things that we've seen in the past. So in the 1960s, there was this kind of semi-ultra leftist position that even came from Maoist and whatnot, to see the students as a new subclass that did not either become labor aristocrats like the working class, or even, you know, had some kind of unique relation that detethered them from capitalist class relations somehow. All this is really unclear to me. And so they, with the Maoist model, can join up with national liberationist movements and identitarian movements and other movements that we might call bourgeois revelationists. And when I say that, I'm not saying that as an insult. Like I think from the Marxist perspective, some of these movements are necessary. But that should be where we place our hope. And they were drawing that on the revolutions in national liberation, which were semi-communist, or at least aligned with the communist movement, but a lot of them were also in the unaligned movement, and they weren't still very few of them actually formed communist or socialist governments. So that gets seen with the hope there. So you have this tendency in Maoism, these tendencies in the ultra left, all these get muddled together. But in the experience of the 70s, most of that falls away. Now, it is interesting to me that a lot of these primary texts that Theory Communiste and Endnotes are drawing from, and Endnotes in particular is weird because they pull from all this and they pull from analytic Marxism without admitting that they're doing it. But if you actually look at their citations, there's a ton of Przeworski and all these analytic Marxists in their citation notes. So you realize that, oh, they're pulling from all these like post-70s things, but they are positing as something new, and also they're distinguishing themselves from the other tendencies in communization in France, because like Tikkun and whatnot are explicitly anarchist and reject any, like they just reject any form of class distinctional legitimacy outright, whereas the communization theorists in English are not. They are very cagey on whether or not they're anarchist or ultra-left Marxist.
I think their position would be that anarchism on their terms, any sort of honest anarchist would have to basically join forces with their position, because they feel that they've incorporated the anarchist position internal to the communist position. And that's actually something that's somewhat common in a lot of post-Marxism. I'm thinking even here of Japanese Marxism, from Uno onward up through, like Kojin Karatani is a great example, where in Trans Critique, Karatani basically tries to prove, and he does a pretty damn good job, that like all of Marx's polemics with Bakunin and with Proudhon were not that big of a deal. Basically, and that Marx sublated and incorporated these polemics, these debates with anarchism, into like how else would you understand the notion of withering of the state if it weren't for his debates with anarchists?
Right.
Yeah, that's an achievement of anarchism internal to communism. So they're on that line, and I think we're building slowly to a point where we can sort of look more at our present. I think we're kind of in the 1970s still, which is fair and good. And I think you're right about the idiosyncrasies of Endnotes and its eclecticism. It's strange. There's a lot of unthought pockets in ultra-leftism that I find interesting from the standpoint of a kind of of their own discourse, of even their own subjectivity as intellectuals around like implicit solidarity with libertarian ideals, implicit solidarity in some cases with liberal positions. I mean, who else doesn't care about the working class?
Right.
And answer me that, right? Like, what are the consequences of holding these views? Now, of course, for you, which is one thing I like about you, you're not going to discard the ultra left with a kind of smirk and a kind of bravado of a condescension. You're going to actually take them quite seriously. I don't know if they take us seriously, or if they take. That's actually one thing that can be challenging with working with another thinker we didn't mention here is Jacques Camat. I would actually argue that Camat, in his work Capital and Community and other works, is almost the leading philosopher of communization theory in some ways.
Well, he's also where when people accuse communization theories, particularly theory communist and Endnotes, of being crypto primitivist. In Camat, it's if you look at that lineage, you're like, well, John Saracen cites two people as his inspiration for primitivism outside of like Ted Kaczynski, and that is Adorno and his kind of, I think, very undialectical reading of the dialectic of enlightenment, and Camat. Like those are the major inspirations. So, in Camat you have this revolutionary, I call it the revolutionary melancholy, maybe a little bit out of Enzo Traverso's book on this, but where he gives up on the idea that revolution is possible because the working class subjectivity has been totally inculcated in capital. Like, and this is a position that.
But by the way, that's a historicist position, as far as I understand. which is
Right.
interesting. Which is interesting because he's basically saying he makes a distinction between material community, which is basically the proletariat as a community which has been fully absorbed by capital, which in a weird way is like exactly what Sloterdijk is saying in his book, The World Interior of Capital.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there's a lot of people are saying this, right? I mean, even Alain Badiou, in a sense, is saying this, right? Why did Badiou go from late 60s up through the early 70s? Yeah, students, but what were the students doing? They were creating the mass line in the factories, right?
Well, here's the thing that I think we have to kind of deal with is there's a lot of ways in which the ultra left position, and we have to distinguish this. For a lot of Marxist-Leninists today, will not distinguish between the ultra left and the left opposition. And the left opposition, that's communist. Trotsky is the form that's primarily survived. Those things coming out of Bolshevism that are not ultra left. They do not reject the party. They do not reject. The necessity of a state transition, etc.
But even someone like Jacobin magazine will call both tendencies ultra left.
Right. Yeah.
Which
I mean,
well,
Jacobin magazine will sometimes even call like MMTers ultra left. I mean, like.
Yeah, I see this also. I mean, I really like Ben Burgess a lot, but I see it with him. I see it with a lot of people where the tendency is to, I mean, anything that deviates from a very prescribed kind of vision. For that matter, even I guess the Cornel West thing with the People's Party is ultra left for them.
Right.
So then you run the risk of, is ultra left anything not working with the Democratic Party?
I mean, well, the way it was used, I actually one time did a response to a discussion that was had on the Dig with the way they defined ultra left, using a particularly, like using a Pito Camejo reading, but by taking Camejo out of his own context and pretending his own context didn't exist, like he wasn't a founder of the Green Party, etc. And that Camejo was a big left unity guy before that was a rallying cry in the same way. He basically took a quasi Marxist position that you needed to reunite the Trotskyist tradition and the Maoist tradition, and even if you could, like formal communist Comintern parties back together, and just get them over their faction bans and go. I mean, in some ways, it is similar to the position held by the kind of cosmonaut neo-Kautskyist today, but he wrote something about the ultra left, which he was critiquing the student left of the 60s, and there's some things in there where they try to like deduce not from Lenin and from Marx things that Lenin and Marx don't say, and I find them so incredibly broad that you can basically accuse anybody of being the ultra left if they aren't willing to be a popular frontist. And one thing we can say about one of the weird things about today is you have Marxist Leninists who uphold Stalin on the internet who maintain 1951 economic concessions that he made, but right before he died, but also hold to third periodism, which Stalin and the Comintern, it's Stalin and the remnants of the official Communist parties, because Comintern doesn't exist by this point, actually. They condemn themselves for misunderstanding the situation and basically being ultra leftist. So it becomes like a hilarious like buffet reading of these positions, but basically ultra leftism left communism is a critique of the merger thesis, because they see the merger thesis as creating bureaucracy, and I think we see that all together in it. But what I think we have to deal with is like there are things that rhyme with this that we're developing in the socialist world that do make it hard not to see how there's some continuity. So, for example, the official ending of United Front politics by all sides, so except for the Trotskyists who redefine United Front. But so for example, in the Second International and in the Comintern, United Frontism, there's two forms later on, and a lot of people think this was invented by someone like Hal Draper. They're not. They're actually officially communist doctrine. There's United Front from below and United Front from above. But the key of United Front, and this is one of the things why it doesn't even make sense to talk about in the United States, is like, oh, you might support a government militarily, defensively. You might help them win a war. You might support their policies on an individual instance, but you will not co-rule with them. You will never form a coalition government with them. Mm-hmm. The Popular Front, what makes it different is that you do. Now, what makes this a little bit more complicated is that the United Front in China was redefined by the Comintern, not by the Chinese, as necessitating joining in a coalition government with the Kuomintang, a officially nationalist capitalist party. And really, what happens after 1936 is that thing that it was initially unique to the Soviet relationship to China is generalized in the quote need to fight fascism, unquote. Although, who is fascism when you're fighting them? It's not totally clear till 1941 because like the Soviets are still trying to court the Japanese that late, and the Molotov and like with people like, oh well, you know, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, for example, is after the end of third periodism, so you can't. It's a mess, basically. Mm-hmm. But what you see in China, again, is this development of mass line politics. Well, in some ways, the kinds of things that you see in the ultra-left that come out of the Council Communists and parts of the Bodeguist currents, although Bodeguists were workerist, and they were national liberationists historically, so they are not as guilty of this as their children, is that they end up taking a similar line to, say, Maoists who believe in the mass line. It's like, well, it's the united oppressed classes all together in a popular line, which is for a lot of people a regression to pre-Marxist forms of socialist politics. And what makes it interesting is that the justification for, like, say, EndNote's doing this and, say, post-Maoist groups doing this are the opposite, but the result is the same.
Yep. Yep. Very great point. Yeah. The result is the same. I mean, I like to pay attention to the way that the Maoists did their workers' inquiry, mm-hmm. which was a, kind of rigorous, I guess you could say in some sense, anthropological form of analysis and study into the kind of movement, the possibility, the health, if you will, of the class struggle. And there does emerge some findings in about the early 1980s. As neoliberalism really becomes kind of concretized, right? Is that basically what the Leninist model had available to it is, to use Badiou's language, fully become saturated. And he actually points to the Solidarity movement in Poland, which was a kind of liberal, reactionary, almost counter-revolutionary push against the ossified Soviet regime in that country. But what's interesting about the Solidarity movement in Poland, which, by the way, Leszek Kolakowski, the great Polish Marxist, was sort of the philosopher of this, it's a liberal counter-revolution in some sense, was the fact that they used Leninist tactics. And when Badiou observed that, he argued that Leninism to use this language again, has not dead, but has become saturated. It's kind of its time has come to some conclusion. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And therefore, all of the worker inquiries were not efficacious in producing results. So mass line basically was defunct in some ways, mm-hmm. which is a very interesting development. I mean, if you read like Assad Haider, he's huge on this in his Viewpoint magazine. He's huge on this kind of what is workers' inquiry mean in the era of neoliberalism, right? And I feel that from that standpoint, because Badiou will still retain the word or the signifier of worker, right? But recognize that it's fundamental change owed to not only the reforms and the eradication of labor unions, the financialization of capitalism, the porosity of borders, right? The rise of what he calls nomadic proletariat, right? So a whole new conception of internationalism needs to be thought about. A whole new conception of imperialism needs to be thought about. And then I think the question is, how far are you going to go in terms of re-theorizing Marxism? And here, Hardin Negri, Badiou himself, Laclau and Mouffe, they go really far. They go really far, and they revise a lot, right? And that to me is what we're living with today in terms of the world of theory and how it interacts with practice. Some people might say, forget theorists, Hardin Negri have no impact. Laclau and Mouffe have no impact on real struggle. I actually disagree.
No, they absolutely do have an impact. They're the opposite. They're the non-anarchist end of the actual real influence of the ultra globalization movement into Occupy. And
exactly.
And yeah. You know, I think to pretend that particularly when the parties were more like, when the parties are more or less dead. I mean, we haven't got to, you know, Lukacs' self-conscious organization of the proletariat stuff yet.
Yeah, we can go back to Lukacs, because I feel like Lukacs' time is now kind of coming in the wake of the post-Marxist moment, which again, when you fuse it with Lacanianism, you fuse it with post-structuralism, you realize that what happened in the humanities and the social sciences after the Second World War, especially in France, but also in the US, just in general, was a lot of very radical discoveries, right? Across the humanities disciplines. And Marxism, like it or not, is like couched within about 6 or 7 different disciplines across the humanities. It is, right? You just can't escape that. You add Freudianism in there, you add psychoanalysis in there, and you got a mess on your hands, right?
Right.
The thing that I worry about is that people are so beleaguered and exhausted with the residues of the failures, the practical failures of post-Marxism, that I often find myself in these debates where it's like, well, what's the use of even working at all with the intellectual fields, with the disciplines, with the humanities, and so on? And I know that you're somebody that's not an anti-intellectual, you're far from it. And that's one thing I really love about Varn Vlog and everything you're doing. But talk to me about where we're at with this kind of, first of all, do you agree that post-Marxism is kind of teetering and collapsing right now?
Oh yeah, I think the fact that it's a slur now is kind of the case. However, what's replacing it is what I would say a caricature of Marxist-Leninism and a caricature of the historical social democracy. So in some ways, what's replacing it is more guilty of what post-Marxism was critiquing than even what actually existed at the time, because it understands itself through the lens of two things: post-Marxism and anti-communism, and it's basically inverting those assumptions. And so instead of trying to learn from what led to post-Marxism, there's stuff to learn from anti-communism, but most of it is negative. But there is reasons to be like, let's quit pretending that like postmodernism was just an active betrayal of these intellectuals, because they were members of these parties. These parties did have intellectual cadres. these were sincere debates, and they were not removed from party organization, and that's definitely the case of Badiou. They're not removed from actual struggles. That's definitely the case in the case of Althusser, Althusserians, and Foucauldians, etc. That it is a misconception to see if they are removed from that, then so was the intellectual leadership of, say, the Second International.
You're totally right. I mean, somebody actually said something very poignant. There's a quote from Foucault where he said at one point, "You can understand the majority of my theorizations of power as a commentary on the way that the culture of Stalinist bureaucracy functions, as a commentary on that."
Right.
You can understand Althusser as a attempt to find a light beyond the sclerotic bureaucratic mess of French Stalinism, right? So, yeah, I think that's extremely important.
But I do think it's dying, and I do think I also don't think this current form of what I call caricature Marxist-Leninism is going to be around for very long. And caricature social democracy, which is really larger, because let's be honest, I think a lot of what's driving caricature Marxist-Leninism is a reaction to caricature social democracy.
So I feel like that's obviously a slight pejorative.
Oh, it's an extreme pejorative.
That's fine. I mean, I feel like we need to separate out, like we need to kind of take a wider lens here and start to point to some actual existing tendencies, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I think that would be good.
So, one thing I can say that we've seen in the rebirth of, say, Marxist-Leninism is that it's not led into a rebirth of Marxist-Leninist organizations. While there has been an increase in the CPUSA and the PSL, which itself has an interesting history and was not always a Marxist-Leninist organization, well, it may have technically been, but the organization of which it emerges from was not. And their split was not ideological. Even they will tell you that. Is that we have not seen like new Marxist-Leninist parties emerge of any significant size. What we have seen is things that are actually structurally very similar to BLM, Occupy, etc., in that they are movements of affiliation that are informal, are quasi-formal, or have like multiple formal attachments, but none of them drive, none of them are mass, none of them are even like large sectarian. We're not, with the exception of maybe the PSL and the CPUSA, in the United States, we are not dealing with parties that have more than a couple thousand people in them. And in the case of the PSL and the larger case of the CPUSA, you're still at most, and these people are hedging their numbers, but from the numbers that we can deduce is about 5,000. We've also seen not the collapse of the DSA, but its continuing irrelevance in that, like, I don't even hear people talking about it anymore, except for different groups trying to take it over and turning it into something else. And that includes from many people who, while not formally totally in the leadership of the DSA, were crucial to its reemergence as the primary, quote, Marxist clearinghouse, unquote, like Bhaskar Sankara and Jacobin Magazine, etc. If you're one of the things that you have to ask yourself is like, why is no one talking? Why is the discourse around DSA basically collapsed this year?
Right.
Its numbers are shrinking, but it's hard to tell how much, and it's still the largest organization that the U.S. has known in the socialist world since the CPUSA in the 50s. But it is remarkably unimportant right now. Even in the social democratic organizing. Okay, so why is that the case, and why do I call this caricature? Because what does vanguardism mean and democratic centralism mean without a fucking party? I have no idea. Like, it means you have an emotional attachment to the 1940 Soviet Union. What about it? As we were pointing out earlier, a lot of these people aren't like pulling from like a set of positions that are consistent to, say, the Bolsheviks in, say, 1936, or the Bolsheviks in, say, 1941, or the Bolsheviks in 1950. That they are kind of picking and choosing ad hoc, and there's no party apparatus to really enforce it. And even when these people are in organizations, and a lot of them are, they're in the same organizations as the Social Democrats a lot of the times. So that's not the same thing. Why do I say character social democracy? One of the most interesting debates that was actually pretty enlightening, even though it was in the context of the total collapse of Trotskyism in America, is the debates between Charlie Post and the Jacobin editorial team about the Popular Front in 2019, where Charlie Post predicted, like, look, you think you're able to do the Popular Front, and this time you're going to run it not the Marxist, Leninist, Stalinist, and so it's going to go better. But what you're actually going to do is wed people more to the Democratic Party, and then when they respond to that, they're going to take positions that they associate with more abstentionist stuff. Since the ultra left is seen and so tied into Occupy, and people are also rejecting that is part of the growth of the DSA, if we are honest, then where can you possibly go? But since there's no organizations, or there's no Comintern, there's no real international, what does it mean to call yourself any of these? It is a self-identification that can't grow. It is stultified in time. Like, if Stalinized Marxism-Leninism was a living tradition anywhere, and it might be in, say, Vietnam, that is not the communism that anyone in America, France, etc., are turning to at all.
Right.
So, like, even in so much that there are,
unless you have a theory of Stalinism, like you saw in, perhaps you read it, the recent Current Affairs, the Nathan Robinson magazine, where they kind of put forward a theory of Stalinism as a psychological type, as like a bigot, like a liberal theory of Stalinism would say,
which is rooted in Adorno. I mean, like, let's be honest, because that's what the authoritarian personality is supposed to be.
That's right. That's right. It's one of Adorno's, a great blemish on his record to put forward that text. And I think he regretted it, obviously, later. So it's a really naive notion of subjectivity, right?
Right. I also think, like,
problematic, right?
Christopher Lasch's turning on the Frankfurt School, even though he was highly influenced by them, is basically, like, kind of in shorthand, is his going, the authoritarian personality slanders the working class.
Right.
And interestingly enough, one of the funny things is the liberal sociological study that pairs with it. There's another study done that does the same thing, actually finds something that is closer to what Marxists would think. So not just as the notion of subjectivity kind of skewed, it seems like, from what we gather looking at the data, that there was the Frankfurt School skewing it to make the working class look more authoritarian than other liberal studies were even finding. Mm-hmm. So I find that interesting. But yeah, I mean, Nathan Robinson seems like, this is the I know I'm friends with some people who are friends with Nathan, but I consider that like the poor man's version of a very bad turn in the Frankfurt School. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's actually the other thing, is like you mentioned Baudrillard, and I feel like it's worth us throwing out there the fact that there is a kind of post-68 philosophical pessimist position. You could call it a left Nietzschean view. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's very interesting that, the what was it, the Gang of Four and the Chinese Cultural Revolution broke with artistically, aesthetically. They broke with the tradition of socialist realism.
Mm-hmm.
And that break was very much a Nietzschean break, right? And there is therefore a sense in which collective liberation is sort of a fool's errand, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the category of revolution is off the table. It's kind of, if you like, a kind of continual cultural revolution.
Right.
And here you kind of need to do the work that Oscar Necht and Alexander Kluge did in their analysis of a very important distinction they make between capitalist cultural revolution and proletarian cultural revolution. And here we're kind of brought back into this notion of like, well, actually, where the left Nietzschean cultural revolution position, let's say, like Deleuze in his book on Nietzsche, was very clear on this, very huge on this, that there is a kind of revolutionary cultural contribution that Nietzsche makes here. And so, yes, they retain the category of revolution, which I think is interesting. But if you read Kluge and Necht, they really show that capitalist cultural revolution produces some very intensified irrationalism and some highly repressive. I mean, they actually say that capitalist cultural revolution is a kind of breeding ground for fascism, in a sense, is what they argue in their book Public Sphere and Experience. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that what do you? I'll form it as a question. I see it a bit in Adorno. I see it a bit in Lacan and Lacanianism. I see it a bit in Deleuze. I see it a bit in left Nietzscheanism. I see it a bit in Baudrillard. I'm generalizing here, but stick with me, which is a notion of a kind of subjective singularity, a kind of a radical extension of a kind of unmet form of individualism, singularity, subjective singularity. Perhaps we can even invoke situationists, the neo-situationists in this regard as well, where they too give up on collective liberation, collective emancipation, due to the rise of the new class, due to the contradictions of late capitalism, etc. But they do provide a philosophical critique of a kind of strategies for overcoming reification, overcoming subjective alienation, etc. So whether we qualify that with a dignified name of revolution, perhaps we do, perhaps we don't. What do you make of those lines of inquiry?
Well, I think they're interesting, and I hate to use the oft-abused phrase in Marxism that something is undialectical, but I do think that one of the things that they do is, because of the rise of the new class, they see collectivism as given towards bureaucratization, the creation of internal elites, etc. And so instead of like trying to come up with collective answers to those problems, and really there's only a couple even attempted. You could see the Cardona system mixed with Cybersyn, although Cybersyn's given way too much importance. The Cardona system is not given enough importance in Allende's Chile. But of course, they don't use either of those things with the military, so they're open. You can see parts of the end of the Mao era Cultural Revolution before the Gang of Four, particularly in the early to mid 70s, where you have Mao radically empowering local, mostly on, unfortunately, peasants. He seems to be terrified of this in the cities, but totally willing to do it in the countryside. Forms of organization and saying, okay, you don't need a mediator with the party. It can be you and the party. You are the party.
Like that's a very helpful point, because in their analysis of Mao's Cultural Revolution, Kluge and Necht, they argue that Well, yeah, Marx talked about mode of production and revolutionizing mode of production, but cultural revolution argues that it's the object of the cultural revolution is the object of production, right? Which is the transformation of the social relations, of the public sphere, of the inculcation of new habits. So here you see the Nietzschean field open, right? And in a way, this is another way to understand the paradoxical incrustation, I would say, of Maoism with forms of hyper contemporary liberalism in the absence of real organizational mass politics. What we have is hyper continuation, not of proletarian cultural revolution, but of some sort of strange cultural revolution, right? I mean,
well,
why are people?
So let's talk about this in the case of China specifically, because I think this is actually a great point. One of the things that we can talk about here is that there's a tendency of Marxist Leninist and also analytic Marxist and also Deleuze and Guattari, a bunch of different groups do this, to view relations of production as somehow part of the superstructure and not the base of society, whereas the base of society for Marx, in so much that is a meaningful thing, includes both modes of production and relations of production which undergird the modes. So what we would consider cultural, our state relations or legal relations, actually does have to be broken down to whether or not it's base or superstructure based on whether or not it affects the way we organize the mode of production directly. And that's why it's also a feedback loop. And by a feedback loop, it really is something where part of the thing is in the other thing. Like, and the Western takes of the Cultural Revolution, they actually don't deal with that. They start saying, okay, and I guess this is actually a great point to point out a distinction of Trotsky that I think that I don't take the Trotskyist line on, but I think is actually interesting to talk about. Trotsky's permanent revolution rejects two things. All right. One of the things that it rejects is the idea that you have to have a bourgeois revolution and that socialists can't organize state capital. He still kind of seems to think the state capitalism is necessary, and that is not his critique of the Soviet Union. That is later Trotsky's critique of the Soviet Union, which they kind of get from anarchists and other kinds of Marxists, like abstentionist Marxists, people who are quasi-ultra-left, etc. But Trotsky's critique is not that. And the second thing he rejects is the division between political and cultural revolution, because there's a two-stage model of revolution that's accepted and codified in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, based off the Soviet experience. At first, we had the October Revolution, then we had the Civil War, then we had the Soviet Cultural Revolution. And people forget there was a Soviet Cultural Revolution. And this two-stage theory of revolution is seen as necessary because both the political revolution and the cultural revolution aren't needed to change the mode of production. And so you actually can't accuse Marxist-Leninists of not understanding this. They do. The Trotskyist critique of this is basically, no, we need permanent revolution. You can't separate out the political and the cultural revolution. They have to be happening concurrently at all times. We don't know what that actually looks like because Trotskyists never win. So, like anywhere other than, the initial winnings they had as part of the Bolsheviks. So we actually don't have a model for what they mean, which is why if you talk to Trotskyists now, if you ask them what permanent revolution means, you'll get like 50 different answers.
Right. Very good.
But this is the context of that distinction.
Yeah.
I think this is actually kind of important because what we see ends up happening in the 60s. And this is actually interesting, a way for us to go back to Lukacs too, even though, because I do agree with you, he's a man of the moment for good and ill. was largely anti-Lukashian until recently, and actually it was because while I love the reification essays in History and Class Consciousness, I actually still think his Word as Marxist method essay, which was contentious, is bad. It's like it's not useful. But that distinction is going to be important. One of the things that we see in Lukashian thinking is that you can't deal with this unless you deal with the totality of bourgeois thought, and talking about it in systems or in structures, right, leads you to think you can compartmentalize this and do parts at one time or another. So while like you never get Lukács ever condemning like the Marxist-Leninist two-stage theory of internal revolution, there is an implicit critique in it that actually does mean that Lukács is a little bit closer to Trotsky here, but he's not a Trotskyist. So there is that issue with this notion of totality. The problem that you have, though, with like I said, with the Trotskyists is we don't know really what exactly they think you should do, because they never win enough to implement anything for us to do it. And part of that is that Trotskyism is both sectarian but also maintains the Bolshevik faction ban, which means that they split over any difference. Like they have to. There's no other logical way for them to maintain their positions and not. It's while this is also a problem in Maoism is just as fractious as Trotskyism. It is, I think, ideologically inherent to Trotskyism, and what makes it even more complicated is that outside of France and the United States, and then later in Latin America, Trotskyism never had a mass working class base. It did a little bit in the U.S., particularly in the 30s.
Pre-civil rights, right?
Right, yeah. I actually
that was the most exciting time of Trotskyism, and frankly, it's hard to overstate its influence. Bringing C.L.R. James to radicalize Black proletarians. There's all kinds of wonderful things that happened. They were if you were an intellectual leftist during that time, Trotskyism was the game in town. Without
it also enabled you to dodge like being accused of being a Soviet spy. Yep. So
sure. Right.
But yeah, it was the game in town in Britain.
And a lot of those problems there of Stalinism affected intellectual culture, especially, and you see this with Max Eastman, especially in the blossoming. There was no bohemian offshoot of like what Stalinism allowed for. Like it shut all of that kind of Dionysian left student quasi-Nietzschean energy, which I think is actually, I'm not opposed to that energy. I think it's actually very important, right? Like actually, I think like Max Eastman's failure to bring Bolshevik bohemianism into Greenwich Village that was truly political meant that the American left couldn't have a truly politicized cultural revolution that would lead into and funnel into the new left, right? So there's something stunted in our depoliticized conception of that we've inherited from the new left.
So, I mean, we get Maoism, interestingly, basically from France, and we basically get it by accident. And then we also get it from the fact that the more radical end of Black nationalist activists in the CPUSA end up incorporating a lot of Maoism because of the initial success of the RCP split from the CPUSA. So, I mean, we now think of the RCP as kind of a joke because of Babakian, but Babakian is not a founder. And it does come out of a CPUSA split, mainly over how you should relate to China. Um, and that is when the CPUSA also stops being as gregarious in supporting Black arts, the civil rights movement, etc. Because, I mean, one of the things that we have to deal with in America in particular, but even in the developing world, is the Soviet insistence on national liberation did mean that they were willing to support a whole lot of stuff in Africa and Latin America, and even in the United States, even when it wasn't very popular. So, for one of the things I was interested to learn in recently was like even Black communists, like the Black Belt thesis was a minority position, but it was one held by a lot of Black communist leadership, but it was never actually popular amongst even Black communist rank and file, which I find interesting. But that until
Can you define the Black Belt thesis for listeners?
Oh, the Black Belt thesis was that you needed to treat the South as a Black national liberation movement, and not because the white proletariat was in the South was irredeemable, but that those contradictions had necessitated a national split there. And
well, we see this actually today. In fact, I was just down in Jackson, Mississippi, and the mayor is the son of Lumumba, who held to a similar Black nationalist vision, and actually, I forget the name of it, but they did like legitimately carve out a physical territory, which the son Lumumba today and they're incredible despite all of the challenges they're facing down there. They still have fidelity to this vision. It's an interesting side point.
I think Assad Haider is actually very good talking about Amir Baraka's oscillations from being a Black cultural nationalist to being a Marxist Black nationalist to being something beyond that, and then going back depending on the time period you look at, say Amir Baraka. But and I actually also, when people accuse Christopher Lasch of Heron folk socialism, I always point out that he never, even though he criticized Black nationalism as not having a coherent subject because it's not really a nation. I mean, he doesn't say that outright, but when he compares it to Jewish nationalism and Irish nationalism in the diaspora, he's like, well, but what nation does Blackness correspond to?
And not to mention that Elizabeth Lasch Quinn did her dissertation on the same topic, inspired probably by some of her father's writings and reflections on this, on the settler. She focused on the settler house movement, which was the precursor to any Black nationalism that's distinctly American, but although its composition, by the way, was not really socialistic at all, it was actually philanthropically liberal, right? So it was a kind of exclusive cultural development project, communal development project that had outside big finance money during basically the Gilded Age, the Reconstruction era, late 1800s. And you can see why for Lasch, all of the kind of familial dynamics were kind of at their apex, you know, because all Black mentors, everything was functioned very, I mean, her book on it is worth looking at because it's not really talked about. The settlement housing movement is not talked about much at all, but it's pretty radical.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, one thing Marxists tend to do now, because we live in such I think a degenerate form of capitalism, is we forget that capitalism ever had any progressive elements at all. But one thing I will say about this in regards to Lasch has criticisms of the Black nationalist movement, but he basically says that it's way better than Black Power because it's coherent. And his criticism of Black Power is that, well, while it tries to deal with some of the problems of the Black national movement, it isn't coherent. You don't really know what the vectors of power are. But I bring that up because Lasch, for all of his romanticism, I think late Lasch can be legitimately criticized for being slightly romantic about like 19th century early artisan bourgeoisie. He never turns on the civil rights movement. He never condemns Black nationalism. He never, like, he actually, one of the things about his critiques of his critique and eventual embrace of populism is is interesting because he basically says, when people accuse you of being racist, they're right, but look at the civil rights movement. We could do something with it. The civil rights movement was, broadly speaking, more a populist movement than a socialist one. And I think, that's fair enough. Doesn't really, I don't know, ultimately help us very much. But I think it's important to look at why that was felt to be the case. Nonetheless, by the end of the 1950s, this commitment to the black strata of the CPUSA gets harder and harder for them to do. They just don't have as much money to culturally to maintain all these black cultural institutions. And then you start seeing in the beginning of the 1960s, with people like Cruz, etc., Harold Cruz, push back on the socialism part for a pure cultural black nationalism, in which they leave. And you see a lot of black artists leave. That's James Baldwin. That's Richard Wright. That's
and they go to the Congress for Cultural Freedom.
Right, and they get picked up by anti-communists for the most part.
Right.
The exception is people like Lorraine Hansberry, who just doesn't live long enough for us to know how that's going to play out.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other movements who went into the civil rights movement, and then you have this kind of late break off with the Black Panthers, who are an interesting thing because they are technically Marxist-Leninists, but they're also highly anarchist infused, and they're one of the first groups to give up on workers' power in some sections of it, but there's also sections of the Panthers who are absolutely insistent on workers' power. So when you see people try to generalize the Panthers today, they don't deal with the fact that, like, Huey Newton and
Cleaver
and Eldridge Cleaver and Fred Hampton
yeah.
all actually have slightly different views on who the revolutionary subject is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And even Cleaver's initial, tendency towards prioritizing the lumpen, which has a very Bakuninist element to it, really, almost explicitly. His observations about the lumpenization of the working class, and particularly the black working class in particular, are actually not unfounded.
Right.
So, he's in some ways, I think, trying to deal with revolution, like despair that if lumpenization is a prevention of a revolutionary subject, then the lumpenization of the black working class means that they are excluded from the revolutionary subject, and the Black Panthers obviously cannot accept that.
Yeah. There's that, but then there's Newton's later development of what he calls intercommunalism,
Mm-hmm.
which is a kind of post-colonial internationalism around sort of lumpen theory combined with kind of communization theory in a way.
Yeah, you see, ironically, kind of like France, the Black Panthers are actually a predictor of the problems you're going to see on the left, particularly after the death of Fred Hampton.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's
you're right.
But you see this problem in the CPUSA and its kind of uneasy relationship with black nationalism that leads to split. Maoism further exacerbates this.
Mm-hmm.
Maoism is of color, from the American framework. Not so much as that's it. The non-alive movement speaks to a lot of concerns that, the increasing perception that, like, the USSR is a white country, even though that's a new perception. And it's a fake one. I mean, like even from our standpoints of race, the USSR is not totally white. But you have these kinds of shifts, and I think one of the things that kind of drives current Marxists crazy that I think they don't really want to look at is, like, okay, you want to blame postmodernism, but the ultra left is not all postmodern. In fact, most of it wasn't.
Yeah, and when you say postmodernism, it's so vague. I mean,
I think postmodernism is an anti-intellectual slur. But
well, let's keep in mind. I mean, the second, speaking of the Second International as a kind of petri dish of comparison to our present, they had the equivalent in Dewey's thought and James's thought in vitalism. Like they had their own forms of what Lukács calls irrationalism.
Absolutely.
And in a way, Maoism conquered pragmatism, incorporated aspects of pragmatism in its own conception of praxis. So you can't hold a view of a vulgar Lukácsian view, which is to say that all of it needs to be thrown out into the dustbin. Because first of all, that's not what Lukács is really saying. I think that, although, with that said, I do think that this is another sign of his return to our present, which is, frankly, that he gives us this grand kind of from 1848 up through post-May 68 framework for understanding the genealogy of philosophy and of, because if Marxism is composed of multiple discourses from the humanities, philosophy being one of them, Lukács gives us a corner by which to understand the kind of, I would say, the position of philosophy has the most integrity for Marx. So that's another way of a strength. And I think you're right. Another strength of Lukács in our present is the fact that he is not blemished by association with Stalinism. He can get out of that accusation, I think, quite easily. He's not necessarily blemished, even though a lot of Deleuze and Guattari people want to put him in that box. I don't think you can that easily, and nor can you put him in a Trotskyist box. So that is a sort of independence.
You can't put him in a Maoist box either.
And you can't do that either. So there's a certain independence that and I love your point about the totality, because I think what that provides is a way for us to see that the task of Marxist intellectual endeavors, even today, has to take on the class question, not from the PMC hyper thing, but from a more robust intellectual counterculture and intellectual development point of view, which you could call worldview Marxism, which is sort of this thing that I think Lukács inspires in Marxist thought today. We don't have much resources for that. There's not any endowed chairs of Lukács studies. Despite what most people may think, these ideas we're talking about are actually not talked about in contemporary academia. They're just not. So,
no, not this part of Lukács, no.
Right? Exactly.
So, like, how is Lukács used in academia? I want people to understand. I used to hate Lukács. Right. The reason why I hate Lukács is his role in academia, because of Sarah Harding and Donna Haraway and a bunch of Marxist and post-Marxist feminists who I don't even think were necessarily wrong for this, but basically use Lukács to build standpoint epistemology and not to go off. If I have a problem with intersectionality, it actually is in standpoint epistemology, because the weak claim of standpoint epistemology, I think, is obviously true. The qualitative experience of people of oppressed groups you should listen to because they experience it and you don't. And that does give them certain insights into the structure of the larger system. However, the strong form of standpoint epistemology, which has become a liberal assumption, is that this gives them insight to the totality of the system. And they get that from a kind of skewed reading of Lukács in the working class, because there's a flattening out of the differences of identities through actually Frankfurt School readings that happen to Lukács that get picked up in the humanities and then get totally liberalized in the 80s and 90s. That gets tied up into intersectionality theory, which is a legal theory. Initially, it's not really says anything about these kinds of issues. It's more like, oh, from a standpoint of law, we can see, in this analysis, this and this happening. And so I blame Lukács for that. And I also blame Lukács for, quote, worldview Marxism as a set of dogmatic prepositions that were substanceless, but held on to too much. And I do still think that the Methods of Marxism essay, The Ends of History and Class Consciousness, is kind of guilty of that, and that's the essay that he got in the most trouble for.
When you say substanceless, what do you mean by this?
Well, by that, what is the methodology of Marxism for Lukacs in that essay? It is the instantiation of workers' power through revolution, and by that, the Soviets, and then he revises that to be the instantiation of a workers' party, so that he's not guilty of tailism, which he critiques himself for. The problem that I have with that is that actually undercuts his whole book, because I'm like, well, clearly reification is part of Marxist methodology. It's how we understand the way capitalist culture and capitalist modes of production interact in a totalizing way. So in some ways, I see that essay is undoing most of the rest of that book. But in Lukacs' defense, and this is something that you have helped me come around on, and my friend Amok Sahu, who is also not, he is a specialist in Lukacs, who's not particularly sanguine on him anymore, but has pointed out that Lukacs does give you a coherent answer to what, like, Marxist virtue, Marxist reason, proletarian virtue, proletarian reason could be in a rigorous sense. Whereas, like, the Bolsheviks do talk about this, and the Second International talks about this, but they are not rigorous in their theoretical instantiations. Lukacs really is. He's trying to work this out in an intellectual humanities capacity. Be like, look, we have our own tradition, morally, artistically, etc. We can defend that tradition within the standards set out for us by Marx himself, and here's how we do that, inconsistent with the categories in which Marx lays out, so that we don't have to just ignore or mechanistically reduce everything that we might consider supercultural to Marxism, and just leave that up to nothing, or up to, you know, whatever the party says or whatever. We could justify how we could arrive at these decisions. Why, you know, why is socialist realism so avant-garde? Well, it's actually related to capitalist realism, and let me explain that out to you. Right?
Yeah.
It's, and I don't always agree with Lukacs' conclusions, but, like, you get a full view of how you can reason, and what reason might mean for a Marxist, because the other two tendencies that we see in regards to Marxism is a kind of totally epochal, like Prometheanism, which is like every instantiation of the human subject is totally different. I mean, we can do anything based off of social reinforcements, which is why I'm not an Althusserian, by the way, because I think, like, this is codified and removed from Hegelian dialectics even by Althusser. And this is even more codified because I am one of the unpopular people who think that Foucault is actually a logical heir of Althusser and Kant. You mix Neo-Kantianism and Althusser together, you get Foucault. So the reason why I reject this and increasingly have come back to Lukacs is because Lukacs does give you a way to say, look, you know, we can reason this out. We can look at capitalist totality. And what Lukacs does not do, which the Frankfurt School does, all right, until you get to someone like Raymond Geuss, who's better on this. But a whole generation from the late part of Horkheimer and Adorno, kind of through Marcuse. Marcuse is a little bit more questionable, but definitely into Habermas and Axel Honneth, etc., is that they take totality to be so all-encompassing that the only way out of it is individual.
Yep. This brings us back to this strange coming out the other end of the chute of this sort of something. Like I said, I see it in Adorno, I see it in left Nietzscheanism, I see it in Lacan. I call it this notion of subjective singularity in the waning or in the absence of collective liberation. There's something that we can still occupy ourselves with, etc. So would you call this a revolutionary impulse? Is that term applicable to what you're talking about here?
In what sense?
In the sense of its integrity to the Marxist meaning of the term.
So the Marxist meaning of revolution does kind of have to be thought of in the terms of the bourgeois revolutions, because that's where we have the clearest longue durée history.
Yeah.
But it's also the point of Marxism is that in some ways the bourgeois revolutions aren't bad. Right. There just is no way in hell they could ever do what they were claiming they were going to do because of a fundamental incoherence in the structure of capitalism.
And that's actually why things like the totality are so important.
Right.
In my reading, it becomes philosophical question, but it also becomes a political epistemological question about, and that this is where you do get things like standpoint.
Right.
But standpoint as understood through relations tethered to exploitation vis-a-vis mode of production, not to essentialized, subtracted theories of subjectivity that are construed into some idealist sense.
Right, and we do have to bring the Frankfurt School and concurrently and simultaneously.
That's hard to do. Yeah, but yes.
But Frankfurt School, and one of the things where people, it's Frankfurt School's fault, where I'm like, it also happens in French Maoism and in Maoism in general, where the nature of focusing on oppression and not the mode of production. And we need to go back here to a fundamental tension between Marxist-Leninist and Trotskyist against Maoist. And no one ever thinks about Marxist-Leninists and Trotskyists being on the same side of a question. All right, but they are on this. The Marxist-Leninists and Trotskyists, because they hold the same theory of imperialism as Lenin, critique is not that Trotskyists were pro-imperialist. The only plausible legitimacy to that is that the Fourth Internationals were opposed to the U.S. entering World War II on the side of the Soviets. But they were also claiming to be defensist, which is bizarre, right? So I think, when people accuse like Trotskyists of being fist communists, that's usually like the one thing they can cite that's legitimate. But Trotskyists and Marxist-Leninists together said, look, the development of capitalism makes imperialism inevitable. It is concurrent and emerging from capital, and you cannot separate the two questions. The thing that all Maoism agrees upon is the fundamental contradiction of imperialism being the more immediate thing to deal with than capitalism, because it treats them as separate questions. Which is interesting because that was the pre-Marxist position of people like Hobson. That like imperialism was a deviation of national capitalism and was something else. And while Hobson and Hilferdin, et cetera, all inform Lenin and Bukharin, which is who Lenin is kind of developing and shorthanding, and they're not exactly the same, but they're close. The primary disagreement with like Hobson and the British anti-imperialist is that no, this is not a separate development from capitalism. You cannot have capitalism without this. Now, this has been dropped from Marxist-Leninist discourse today, but at the time, this was the position of both the Comintern and the Trotskyists. And up until the 1950s, this is largely the case. What complicates this in the 50s is that the only success the Soviet Union really has after the consolidation of the Soviets is in exporting national liberation causes to make allies in the developing world, which becomes its primary mode of exporting revolution, but it does not encourage them to develop socialist modes of production. And in fact, in some cases, actually in many cases in like Latin America, Chile is an example, if you want an example of this very clearly, the communist parties that had an alliance with the USSR were more conservative on national development questions and stuff like that than even the socialist parties were. So what does this have to do with your initial question on Lukacs? And we can tie this back all together. What we see here is the fracturing in all cases of this idea that you have to deal with the totality. You start separating things out.
Yes.
And so you start having, quote, piecemeal revolutions. At that point, I don't know what the fucking difference is from reformism. It's just reformism with guns.
Well, that's such a beautiful point. I mean, John Bellamy Foster was on the show recently, and he reminded us that the most popular book on communism from the 1990s till now, Hardenegger's Empire series, one of its objectives was to put forward the idea that imperialism as a category is no longer of interest to the left, really.
Right.
That, or rather that it needs to be fundamentally rethought, etc. And then they get into that whole, I mean, that's actually part of the reason why sovereignty, Agamben, Schmidt, acephalic power, all of this stuff is coming up, right? Well, so there's that thing, and I think you're right, which is that changes. I never thought about it that way, but you're right. It changes the meaning of a Lukacs in this milieu, in this and this is also why, in like Daniel Lopez's work on Lukacs, what you find there is an interest in expanding the bases of where the totality is lived beyond just labor, where he says that Lukacs harmed the working class struggle because he put too much of an onus on labor as the privileged standpoint. And this actually then would tie into some of this value form stuff we see from Heinrich and these people, where it's a question of value, labor is, so there's that interesting moment that's happening right now in Marxist thought where, yeah, we kind of do need to think the totality from a multiple standpoints, perhaps. I want to get your, this will be our last question. I want to get your thoughts on that. What I hear you saying, Derick, is you're more, you seem, and I've seen this in your show, in Varn Vlog, highly frustrated, rightly so, for the abandonment of imperial struggle by the Western left today, like having nothing to say, et cetera, et cetera. So where do you stand on that?
So I think this is what explains like why a lot of like vulgar Marxist Leninists like me, and again that's a slur, but I think it's a fair one, who are like always trying to convince me that I should take a more pro-Russia or a more unambiguously pro-China. Although I will also caveat this: is I am a defensist on China against the West. I just think we have to deal with China as it actually is, and not how we want it to be. The point where I'm super frustrated is that there was initially, for the last 10 years, actually, you see this in the beginning with Hardenegger and then the alter globalization movement. But once that fails, because the one thing I will give the alter globalization movement over the post-Occupy, quote, millennial left, to use a term that I don't always love from our platypus friends, our frenemies, is that there was not a retreat or a return to internationalism. The experience of the kind of ersatz defensist of various states, some of which it's really hard to defend, like the Iranian state, uh, um, that you see going all the way back into the aughts. And if you really trace it back, you can see it all going all the way back into Foucault in 1978. Is, was responded against with this sort of like methodological nationalism that was also trying to compete with right-wing nationalisms. But it made it really incoherent, because on one hand we're talking about like we need open borders, we need to abolish the police, blah 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 blah. We need BDS. There's a kind of like piecemeal ultra leftism, but it was piecemeal too, because it's like there's not. Well, the one thing you can say about like the Council Communists or Badigas or even the communization theorists, less so the communization theorists actually, they might be guilty of this, but that they had a comprehensive understanding and critique of why they did and didn't do things. There was not like a critique of like abolish the police or completely open borders, but we're not aiming to develop and get rid of nation states or immediate socialism. Like, we're going to do this right now, but only in this area, and it doesn't make any sense. But they also were only focused on national politics, national policy, running for the executive, national union struggles, etc., with like lip service to paying attention to other countries, and maybe like, oh, well, we can talk to Dilma Rousseff and other social democratic people who lost. Not even going to get on that. But that it was truly methodologically nationalist, even down to the terms of economics, like a slightly Marxified version of modern monetary theory that was not the version right now that's trying to like come up with an international theory for it, but very much a national centric theory during this time period was the dominant view of economics up and until the advisors around Bernie Sanders. And so I was very frustrated with that. When that clearly failed in 2020, you saw a rebirth of anti-imperialism, but what it has manifested as is multipolarism, which has no concern about the nature of the states involved, either self-professed or actual governments. So in this case too, multipolarism comes out of British 19th century geopolitical realism as adopted through a couple of different thinkers, one of whom is explicitly reactionary, Alexander Dugin, but it doesn't just come from that. I mean, Farid Sakali talks about a multipolar world. I have no problem with acknowledging multipolarity, but that's like, I have no problem with acknowledging rain. Like, it's just a thing. It in fact, it can play out in multiple ways, some of which might help socialists, some of which would be disastrous to socialists. So, like, in and of itself, it's not something to put up as a good or a bad, nor is it inherently anti-imperial. It is inherently anti-hegemonic.
Yeah. There's another tendency on the left, which I would characterize in a post-2020 milieu, which is basically to turn away from questions of totality vis-a-vis internationalism, vis-a-vis imperialism entirely, so as to go back to the bread and butter basics of like basic class consciousness activity, which, like, I mean, I think class unity would be categorized in that domain. I think some aspects, like the Damage magazine people, these kind of anti-identity politics socialists, right, where the task is a kind of, you could say, a kind of return to the ABCs of working class culture building. And I find some, this is a whole other conversation we can have, about that terrain, because what I find is that they end up in quicksand so easily, and in these polemics, which just end up kind of ossified. And anyways, I think this is a good place to bring it to a close. Otherwise, we would just go and go and go.
Right.
And this has been really fabulous, Derick. I know that my audience is going to get a lot out of this. And thanks for coming on and giving us all of your wisdom and insights. Everybody needs to check out This Is Revolution, for which Derick is a co-host. You have, how many podcast affiliations do you have? Like a dozen?
Not so much anymore. I've cut a lot of them back, but I am still associated with Antifada.
Yep.
I'm associated primarily with This Is Revolution, where I am a co-host on The Crew.
The Crew.
I'm also part of White Guy Wednesday, which ironically is two Slavs and a Kurd. So like the least Anglo whites. I wanted to call it a demelanated hour because I felt that was true. True. But I am vaguely associated with Parallax Views, which is not really a Marxist podcast, but is sympathetic. I sometimes talk to Doug Lane, although that's increasingly rare. Okay. I have been associated with the Emancipation Network, but that blew up. Largely, interestingly, over my answer to questions that we're talking about, also be leading to interpersonal conflicts. But basically, I thought that one of the ironies of ultra leftism is it tends to cut in two ways. And ironically, this is perhaps true of, say, the Nilcom tendency, which has Monsieur Dupont, which is two people, one of which tends to be conciliatory towards national conservatism and rhetoricism and Agamben thought and that sort of thing, Compact Magazine kind of stuff, and the other tends to be towards anarchist and liberal co-optations of anti-communism, basically seeing Leninism and all instantiations, not just critically, which I think you have to do, but as a kind of thought virus, thought crime, like cult mechanism. And so I ended up having to cut with them because a lot of them held the latter view that, like, if you even once thought about Lenin seriously, that you were probably a secret authoritarian. And wow. I'm like, that's communist, that's Congress of Cultural Freedom shit for me.
Right.
So yeah, I used to be associated with a bunch more podcasts, because through that I'm no longer associated with that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say to anybody listening who's this first time hearing Derick Varn talk, one good thing about joining your Patreon through Varn Vlog that I'm a member of would be to say that one thing I like about you is that you are extremely pragmatically engaged in institutional, like, one good thing about you is that you know theory, but specifically how theory interacts in this practical, lived, institutional way. That's your bailiwick, as I see it. That's what I gain from listening to you. Because for me, I tend to be very theory heavy, but I like talking to you because you bring this shit down to earth. So kudos on that. And
thank you.
Everybody should obviously join the Varn Vlog. I like the solo podcasts are good too.
Yeah, I do that. I guess you could also say like at 20 podcasts, because Varn Vlog has a bunch of subcategory podcasts. But yeah, thank you so much. Daniel was singing my praises at the beginning. I realized something the other day that amused the shit out of me, actually, that I was a fan of Daniel's blog work without knowing it was you. As early as 2011 when I started doing my first forays into philosophical and leftist podcasts.
Mm.
Um, so in some ways, indirectly, you and I have been in dialogue for a decade, well, more than a decade, but we've only really known each other and been conscious of each other for the past, what, 5 years, 4 years, something like that.
Or less, actually. We really got connected around 20, like right as the Sanders coalition collapsed. That's when I launched. That's when I met you. And
Yeah.
so it's very recent. It's very
Yeah, as I say, I think I actually know more of your friends than I knew you.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, thank you for the endorsement. But you can find me around for free. And one of the things I will just say to plug this is Revolution, in that its spirits of socialist inquiry is so non-sectarian. Even some of the primary co-hosts do not claim to be Marxist, nor
Right.
like so. It is the sense of like we need to come back and have this conversation with other kinds of socialists, other kinds of leftists, etc. And I think that's something we have to do. I include in that dealing with socialists who are more friendly with things I consider highly deviant, like um, national conservatism, detente with Marxism and former Marxists, etc. Uh, but I would say on that question, that's sort of my line. So, like, if, like, I do think as much as I believe in left unity, you do have to have a line. And being overly enthusiastic about national conservatism means to me you're not a socialist anymore. So, but all that said, I think we do have to talk to them, debate them, engage with them, just like we have to engage with the quote ultra left, which I do. One thing that we didn't talk about, I do come out of that milieu. I was never a communizer,
Yeah.
but I was like in a, I was in the Platypus Affiliated Society after being in a radical tendency within the SPUSA, which is kind of a quasi Marxist Maoist Trotskyist alliance tendency. Weird, into the odd thing. But my engagement with EndNotes is what caused me to have this like realization about my relationship to Platypus, and it's part of the reason why I left. But I very quickly rejected their conclusions.
Yep. Yeah. It took me. That's another thing we share, which I've talked about on your show, is that same kind of initiation and then de-initiation from the ultra left, which gave me a kind of lens to see it. I mean, yeah, and of course we also share the fact that we have a working class background. We both have been conservatives, both been ultra leftists, and so it's all good, my friend. Let's close. Hang tight, but thanks everybody for listening.